Hey everybody, Lucas here. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Real Talk Podcast. Before we get on with the show and the meat and potatoes of it as it were, I have to do a quick shout out for the sponsor of today's episode. Today's sponsor is Jordan of 1,000 Elsewhere. Gospel-centric musings, goods, resources, and creative services from and for an intentional Christian lifestyle. Her shop of gospel goods launched in February, and introductory pricing ends August 31st. So take advantage of these special introductory prices while you still can. You can learn more at 1000elsewhere.ca. That's 1,000 spelled out as the word elsewhere.ca. A big thanks to her for sponsoring the show and making this whole thing possible. Now, on to today's episode.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Real Talk Podcast. Today we got another great episode for you, as per usual. You'll notice a different background behind me. I had no short of technical difficulties on this podcast, so my internet gave out at my house, so I'm at a friend's house recording in front of some nice piece of art. So this is new. The audio might sound a bit different, but we're excited to bring you today's episode. Actually, we thought about 3 years ago when we first started this podcast about doing an episode on church history, and more specifically like the Dutch Reformed church history back to the Secession in Holland. So today we are joined by Mark and Hollander, and we're glad to have him. And he teaches a church history course or a bunch of church history courses at the Covenant Canadian Reformed Teachers College. So welcome, Mark. Looking forward to learning a whole lot.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I need a bit of arm twisting. I figured there's better experts on church history out there. But given that it's fairly fresh for me and I have some experience teaching it, I was encouraged to do it anyway. And so I'm happy to be here and share what I know, although there are other experts out there.
Hey, well, we're happy to have you. I'm hoping to get a bit of a higher level overview of this stuff. I'm sure lots of our older listeners will love the discussion on everything Holland, but hopefully this is edifying for the younger crowd too. Why don't you introduce yourself and how you got into education? And you're teaching at the college now, but how'd you end up there?
Sure. So I've always loved school. I loved Christian education. I grew up with two different elementary schools and then also Christian high school. And so early on already, it was my desire to become a teacher. And so I did study to become a teacher. I got a Bachelor of Arts in History at York University, and then a Bachelor of Education at Brock University in St. Catharines. And from there, by God's providence, I was led to Winnipeg to teach at Emmanuel Christian School. I taught there for 2 years in grade 4, and then moved into vice principalship there and taught some high school courses for a number of years, 5 years. And then the last 7 years that I was there, I was serving as the principal of the K-12 school there. During that time, I got my master's in education, more in the philosophical and historical roots of education. And then, the Teachers College was looking for a faculty instructor. I'd sort of always envisioned that this would be where I'd like to end up. I love schools. I love thinking about education and talking about education. But the time was right for our family to move and to leave, maybe even before people wanted me to leave, which is always a wise thing to do. And so we ended up here at the Teachers College. And one of the courses that I was to take over is church history. And I had taught church history for a number of years at probably at grade 4 level, and then grade 7, 8 level, grade 9 and 10 level, and then also later on in grade 12. So I have some experience with different church history, different eras, and so that's been a natural fit. And so I'm 1 year under the belt at Teachers College here, and very much enjoying it, being busy with thinking about not just church history, but schools in general and covenantal education.
Right on. Yeah, that's... Well, you're definitely qualified. I don't know if you think you're qualified, but you're definitely qualified to speak.
That's right.
Lots of things.
Maybe. I should also mention, of course, that I'm a family guy. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. So I have 6 children, and we live in Beamsville, where we worship in Vineyard Canadian Reformed Church. So I got kids as old as 12 and as young as 6 months, and so that's a big part of who I am as well.
That keeps you busy on all ends of the world, then.
That is the best kind of busy out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Wow. It's a beautiful thing. So what got you interested in church history? Like you say, you taught church history in the past, but is it something you always enjoyed teaching, or is it something that you've enjoyed learning about?
So I'm a history guy. I mostly in my undergrad I did Canadian and American history with some classical stuff in there. It's not really church history at all. So when I started teaching high school, we needed somebody to teach church history, and you only have to be one day ahead of the students. So you learn it as you go. And there's lots of resources out there. I'd say the resources are old and somewhat dull, and so it takes some work to internalize that and then to share it. So that's sort of where my interest comes from, and I enjoy it.
Right. And then you did a course specifically on the Dutch Secession and this kind of time period this year, right?
That's right. So, and that's interesting at the Teachers College because we don't have just Canadian Reformed students. We have students from several Reformed churches. So to navigate that course while highlighting where some of those differences between our churches exist was really a neat experience to go through with our students.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into that once we get into the church history. I'm also curious about, obviously our Canadian Reformed churches, how they came out of and also immigrated into Canada, but it's other denominations as well. Like, what all happened in Hollander and what other branches did we get out of that? So, so what, like history, you're a history guy. I mean, obviously the history pitch is like, well, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. Why is it really something that we should be teaching and learning, other than, the classic adage?
Yeah. So I think beyond that is Psalm 78, right, is our theme at the Teachers College. Tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord. And when we think about history, I mean, in some ways, all of history is church history because God is gathering his church from the beginning of the world to its end. And so all of history exists so that God can do that work. And God is operating on a very high level, and he sees all things and he directs all things for the good of his church. And so when we tell the story of church history, it's that story of God and his work of redemption for the good of his church. And we can trace that story of church history beyond just the Old and the New Testament to carry on beyond it. We don't have a scripture that goes with it, but it all points to a providential God. And I think several times in church history, God sort of lets us see a little peek into how he preserves his church and how he's using providence to lead it in certain directions. And so it's an incredible story that helps us to praise God for who he is and what he does for our lives. So it's not just about learning lessons from it, but standing amazed at a covenantal God who's faithful to his covenant, not just in the Old and New Testament, but still today. And that gives us confidence, right? That he maintains that antithesis, that divide between the church and the world, and he continues to. And the church has faced very difficult things. And if we think of the world today, history's not progressing. We're not getting better, but we're not getting worse either, right? The church history exists as one time through all time and space. We've always dealt with the depravity, and the Lord is faithful, and he maintains his church. And so we don't have to worry about those things. We have a whole history to give us confidence that God is good and he'll provide a way through.
Right. There's always challenging things, and some things seem more challenging. Is it like history is obviously important also for those lessons and those figures in history to learn about and to understand the issues that they tackled. Are there like some pretty clear, I mean, we'll get into more of the specific issues, but are there like really clear examples of issues that they dealt with that we're also dealing with now? Or are we absolutely like living in a different time? Like,
no, so like where we'll start later on talking about the secession. I mean, that's the fruit of the Enlightenment. Well, we're still dealing with the fruits of postmodernism, right? So when the ideas of the world creep into the church over and above God's word, you end up with deformation, and then you need reformation to go back to God's word. And that's just a cycle that exists throughout history. And so the same thing exists in the church today is when the wisdom of the world creeps into the church needs a reformation, right? And it's when you stay faithful to God's word that you stay faithful. And that's a cycle that exists. The whole Old Testament is basically the exact same cycle.
Right. Yeah. So, well, let's just get into it. I want to I want to get into the history, and we can talk about why it all matters too afterwards, because it's something that is good to wrap our mind around why it's important before we gotta sell the young people on it, I guess, to keep listening to the episode. But it's something that it's always, you always want to know why things are like something you should listen to before you dive deep into it. So let's get into it. Like I think probably the best place to start would be like the Reformation, and like just let's briefly work between the Reformation and the 1500s. I don't even know the dates, all the way up to the Secession. And let's kind of just unpack that a little bit before we get into like the nuts and bolts of the Secession and forward.
Yeah. So before I start, so 1517 is typically, I mean, that's Luther, right? And then, the impression I had growing up sometimes is that, God established his church and then stuff happened, and thank goodness Luther showed up. And ta-da! We had Reformation. Everything was great. We celebrate Reformation Day. So one of the joys has been to unpack sort of this period of time from the early church all the way until 1517, where God didn't forget about his church. Be like, oh shoot, I should probably reveal the gospel to them again. But there's this wonderful storyline that exists all the way through, where the Lord is laying the groundwork towards that Reformation. So we can't get into all that there, but that's been one of the things that the new church history curriculum they're working on right now does a really good job of highlighting, is all these wonderful, great characters of the church fathers of the medieval years, where it highlights God's faithfulness to his church and faithful believers in all different places, despite sort of the problems of the Roman Catholic Church at the time and some of the false teaching. So in the whole storyline until now, like we pick little snippets, but at no point do we not have anything in between, right? So we have, the 1517 is the Reformation, but that's just the start of sort of the era that we talk about afterwards, right?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So then when we talk about like speaking specifically about the Netherlands, 1517 you have Luther, but it doesn't stay like the famous story you might have grown up with learning about was the printing press and the wonderful change that it does. And that's always fascinating, because even in a secular world, they talk about the printing press and how it revolutionized everything, and it truly did, right? So one of the questions he sort of had for me was, well, how did it get to be the Netherlands? Well, in the Netherlands, you have Lutheran followers, but a big influence is Calvin. So Calvin, of course, is in Geneva, and he established a seminary there. And the way I always taught it to my students is that the seminary in Geneva is like the epicenter, right? So Calvin exists there, and then there's ripples that go out from it. And so students from Calvin Seminary go back to the Netherlands as well. And so you have Calvinists show up in the Netherlands in all different places. And that's how Calvinism shows up there. So in the Netherlands itself, in the late 1500s, they're under the control of the King of Spain, right? And Spain is staunchly Catholic. The whole European history is messy at this point, so we won't get into the weeds of it. But they're Catholic, and so the Inquisition actually, the Inquisition, which persecuted the Reformed believers, the Protestant believers, was quite possibly the very worst in the Netherlands. That's where the Reformed believers faced the worst persecution at the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, which, if you're a Monty Python fan, gets into you a different rabbit hole. We won't go there. But so huge amounts of persecution there, and of course they would be able to liberate themselves with the help of Prince William the Silent, as he's known. And through the whole 80 Years' War, eventually you have the northern Netherlands, the lowlands, being liberated and becoming a Protestant country. So that's sort of in the late 1500s, early 1600s, where you end up with a Protestant reformed country in the Netherlands.
Right. So a lot of that's like a political dynamic, right? Like, I mean, I guess the politics in the church, like, the church and state were like tied together real hard. Like, I guess like Rome was like that. And then everywhere that, we just don't see that now. We're like, a lot, I guess, probably some places in the world, but we don't have countries that are like imposing their religious views necessarily on their people, especially in the Western world, at least.
You have the whole story of Prince William, and they need a king, and so they're like, oh, we should get the guy from France to do it, and he doesn't want to do it. Oh, maybe the Queen of England, she should be. And if you get there's like real complicated history in terms of before you actually get the Netherlands. One of the interesting things in the Netherlands is that when they do establish a country, they do grant some freedom to the Catholics there as well, but not let's say in a total freedom. Like, it's not like wonderful, blessed peace. But there is some allowance for it. But there was like in the Netherlands, you have fighting between the Catholics, the Anabaptists, and the Calvinists, and there was like real fighting and like killing each other. That takes place, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of bloody wars going on in that time.
That's right, and nobody has clean hands, and I think that's important in church history that we don't portray it that way either. Like nobody, it's a story of God gathering His church through weak and sinful people, right? There's no, we talk about heroes of the faith, and that can be appropriate, but we can't whitewash that history. It's messy and it's very human.
Yeah, we all we like to. It's like, well, the Netherlands, that must have been the best place to be.
That's right.
So, I don't often think of Geneva, Switzerland, being the epicenter. Like, my mind doesn't go to Switzerland when I think about like the Reformation. It goes like Germany, France, England a little bit, and then the Netherlands. Like, so what was it about Geneva that everyone like ended up there?
Well, like Calvin's there, right? So he writes his institutes, and they get translated to a whole bunch of languages. He starts a seminary. There's a reformer by the name of Theodore Beza, who's like the rector, the principal of there. You have students there, like Guido de Brel was a student of the seminary. He wrote the Belgian Confession. Caspar Livianus wrote the Heidelberg Catechism. He studied there. John Knox, who's the reformer from Scotland. He studied there. But you have like Calvinists end up in Hungary. Like to this day, there's the Hungarian Reformed Church is like the largest Protestant church in Hungary. We forget the Reformed believers in Hungary. The Huguenots in France are staunchly Calvinist as well. So we study the Netherlands because that's sort of where we come from. But Calvin's influence and Calvinism exists in all kinds of places, including England, of course, and the Puritans, and that gets transplanted to the United States. So Calvin's influence goes really far and wide.
Right. So like you just mentioned, are there different like streams? The Huguenots end up somewhere. Like, do we see modern day manifestations of these different groups? Like, we're Dutch Reformed, but is there like, there's like,
for sure. Like if you do some research into some of the different Reformed denominations in, let's say, the United States, they have their own things too. Like there's a whole pocket through the northern United States of German Reformed churches. I forget which one it is that has German influence, right? And then you have the Free Church of Scotland that gets transplanted as well, including some in Canada that have Scottish influence that are also sort of Calvinist as well. So each of these different denominations, many of them have their own initial ethnic tie as well. It's just because some of them are older, their ethnic origins are a little more watered down than ours are. We're still a little fresh off the boat.
Right. Well, that makes sense. I guess we'll probably see why, because through the secession, like we've been kind of refined, I guess, and then shipped over here. So but the Netherlands is still very central. So, for instance, in 1619 is when you get the Synod of Dort, right? So in the Netherlands, you have Catholics, Anabaptists, Calvinists, Lutherans, and then you have this whole group called the Remonstrants, or the Arminians, right? And so they convene the Synod of Dort to deal with this, and that's actually hosted like by the monarchy because it's a Protestant country. But you have observers coming from France. Actually, the ones from France, they weren't allowed to come because of the persecution there. But you have observers coming from all different neighboring places, and so you have an international synod at the Synod of Dort. So even though it's our little Dutch place, what happened there at the Synod of Dort in 1619 really had international consequences in terms of preserving the doctrine of free grace, right? Of preserving man's total depravity, the free gift of grace through faith alone. And so, yes, it's in the Netherlands. So yes, it's our history, but that has ripple effects all across Europe and then into the New World, of course. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So you mentioned that it was the state church still, I guess, at that point in 1619, which is pretty soon following the Reformation, really.
I'm not sure exactly. I can't keep track of all the dates in my head.
Me either.
That's right. So, but you certainly have it that they have space for the Synod of Dort. That's where they eventually sort of finalize. The Synod of Dort is crazy. It canons the Dort. It finalizes or publishes the final version of the Church Order of Dort, and it even proposes a church Bible translation, the state brutality. So the state translation. So these are a big deal, right? And so commemorating that is a big deal. That's quite the synod, yeah.
And they had lots of people there too, like even like delegates.
That's right. And I forget exactly how long it lasts, but you can, if you Wikipedia, you can read about all the different members and you can go on all kinds of fun rabbit holes.
I might. That's, How do you get anything done with that many people there?
That's
I guess some are observing, but that's, even the Canons of Dort is like, how do you even produce a document like that at a place in time?
That's right.
I just, I don't understand. It's
different times and different places.
Yeah. Smart people.
Yeah.
So you mentioned it's still the state church at this point, right? In 1619 with the Synod of Dort. I guess we're going to get into the secession when this church and the state really make a hard split.
That's right.
What did that look like though between say the Reformation or the Synod of Dort and the secession? Like, was the state church fairly like tyrannical, or was it was it acting how it should? Or
so if you think about 1619 you have the Canons of Dort, 1834 you have the secession, the first secession, right? And so that's a decent length of time if you think of just eras, like that's many years. It's easy now when you just do a timeline, just jump ahead. But it is remarkable to think, well, you came from this glorious document. Like if you read the Canons of Dort, they're beautiful and they're rich. You think, well, how did you get from here to here? Like you had it. Right. What happened? But you have to remember that in the 1600s all the way to the 1800s, you're dealing with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is like a fruit of the Reformation, where people said, you know what, ideas are open to be explored. And so people said, you know what, let's explore ideas like without scriptures. And so they came up with all kinds of different ideas, and that crept into the church, right? So a huge emphasis on rationalism over faith, right? I'm going to accept something because it's reasonable to me rather than accepting things by faith. And so a big thing, for instance, in the Enlightenment is like, if you some of the big names is like Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke. Maybe you remember those from your high school days. They're all busy with like, what is man like in a state of nature? Like, what are people really like? And even though some of them, like Thomas Hobbes, gets pretty close to depravity, none of them are willing to be, full Calvinists and say, we're totally depraved. Like there's no silver lining. Like as dark as it gets, that's how dark it is.
Right.
And that's what the Synod of Dort had said. It says, we're totally depraved, incapable of doing any good. So when rationalism starts to creep in and these Enlightenment ideas creep in, the first thing that goes is total depravity. And that comes into the churches. So in the years following the Synod of Dort, you see rationalism creep into the churches, where they start to try to make the Christian faith reasonable to the human mind. And so they minimize depravity because nobody wants to hear that. And in some cases, even watering down the gospel to making Jesus a good moral example rather than like the story of substitutionary atonement, that Jesus is just a really good person, not necessarily the person through whom I have eternal life. And so that's one movement that's happening in churches, is like this rationalist one. And that the opposite side to that is a movement called pietism. And pietism says, you know what, all this head stuff, that's not what religion's all about. It's all about righteous living, holy living. And so you have these people focusing on that as in sort of the opposite side of the pendulum. And we all should know that orthodoxy and orthopraxy, like right living and right doctrine, they should go together. But in history, the pendulum always swings back and forth. That's maddening as a church history teacher, because, but that's the history of the church in the Old Testament as well. And so you had both of those movements going on. And so you have the church starting to preach sort of rationalist things, not the full gospel. You have a side movement of pietism going on. And then in, I think it's 1816, I want to say, they imposed a new church order. I'm not sure it's a new church order, but there was a new subscription form that they imposed on the churches. And so they said, instead of saying you have to teach the three forms of unity, because they are faithful confessions of the church, or they echo what the Bible says, you have to teach them insofar as they agree with the Word of God. So they crack open a window. And so all these elders and ministers are no longer bound to confessions, but they're bound to teaching God's Word as it's understood by themselves, insofar as,
which is not bound at all.
No, that's right. So that door got cracked open, and so that all of a sudden the preaching across the Netherlands gets wide open, and you have all kinds of other things start to creep into the churches, and the result is that, like, church attendance is down. There's not a huge emphasis on holy living. You already see that, like, the Dutch go through a massive golden age. I always think that's fun as a Dutch guy. Like, you have this small, tiny country that's competing with all the giant colonial powers. But that also brings with it all kinds of other things in there, right? So it might have been a golden age from a prosperous perspective, but not from a church perspective, not from a holy living perspective. So there's a lot of room for Reformation again in the Netherlands in the 1800s.
Yeah,
and
there's
that's
a lot of
towards the secession.
Right. Yeah, because in that period, there's a lot of, like, I mean, obviously the government had a lot of changes. And I imagine, like, politics isn't keeping things Calvinist, but they're also doing, like, a lot of exploration, and they're like, they're kind of world powers, which is an interesting thing to think, like, such a tiny little place that wasn't even a country years before that. Then they're discovering new lands and sending explorers across seas. And how does that take the focus off the church for the government? Do they kind of, like, I mean, the secession is kind of the church taking off from the government. Do they, was there really were they actually watching over the church, or taking care of it, like what Rome would expect?
Yeah. So, I mean, the church buildings are like this. The ministers all receive salaries from the government. Like, they're all supported by the government. So your tithing is just, I mean, you give money to the church, but it's all taxation, all that. That's all run through it. The church buildings are owned. Capital projects for church buildings, that's all government, right? And it's a cultural Christianity, right? So I'm Dutch, therefore I'm Dutch Reformed. And everybody goes to the Dutch Reformed Church. Everybody belongs to the Dutch Reformed Church. Mm-hmm. There are a few pockets of Catholic churches here or there. The Anabaptists have all skedaddled. They've gone off to Russia and then wherever else they could find a home. And there's still some pockets there left, but really you have a Dutch Reformed country. And so this is not how we designed it, right? This is, like, sometimes we like to think that a theocracy is the way to go. Like, just mandate, you're a citizen of Canada, you're a citizen of the Reformed Church. This is not the way to go. It's not the way to transform hearts and minds, right? Mm-hmm. And so that also creeps into the Dutch Reformed churches as well, right? So people are Christians, but it doesn't necessarily live in their lives. And where it does live in their lives, so you have these groups of people who are faithful Christians, and they're gathering in these groups called conventicles. And these conventicles are like groups of believers where they are focused really carefully on pious living and on holy living and encouraging each other in that, but they're not reforming the church, right? So in the years before the 1800s, you have a movement called the Revive, which is a whole other movement. So if we go like Synod of Dort, then we go Revive, which is like revival. And there's people in there in that movement that bring about revival, but it doesn't reform the church. And that doesn't really happen until the secession, where it actually says, we have reformation within the church in terms of believers, but it doesn't correct the church necessarily.
Oh, interesting.
And that's another one of those examples where it's like, it's not a flash in the pan, Reverend de Kock shows up in 1834, boom, fix the problem. It's the groundwork is all under the surface so that when the Lord creates the right time, the church is allowed to flourish.
Right. Yeah. I guess, so during that time, there wasn't leaders really making moves. Like, I guess if they're all drawing a salary from the government, it's pretty hard to stand up. And
they're all being trained by the government as well, right? So so just jump into the secession. You have a guy, his name is Reverend Hendrik de Kock, which if you're teaching high school history is a terrible name. But he's sort of the main character of the secession. And he's trained in the whole liberal thinking in terms of modernism. He would have preached sermons about man's ability to earn salvation by following Jesus Christ. And so he's preaching in these churches, he's doing these things. And as the story goes, I've read two different versions of this. One is that an elder encourages him to read the Canons of Dort, which is remarkable considering he's trained in the Netherlands canons, and he had not read Calvin's Institutes, nor had he read the Canons of Dort. Right, so here's a minister in the Dutch Reformed churches not familiar with these, and so he reads them. But the other story is that he meets a farmhand in his congregation, a brother by the name of Klaas Kuipinga, as the story goes, and I understand it to be accurate. And his famous quote is that if I only had to add a sigh to my salvation, I would be eternally lost. And I like that story because this is just an average farmer. So sometimes when we teach church history, we hold up these people, but it's actually the Reformation starts in the hearts and minds of regular people as a farmer who would have been uneducated, who understood the gospel of grace, and who used it to call back his pastor, who was this smart, learned man, to say, you don't understand. And so Reverend de Kock reads the Canons of Dort, he reads Calvin's Institutes, and his preaching changes. And it becomes very evident. It becomes so evident that people were coming from all over the Netherlands, packing into the church in Ulrum in the Netherlands to hear Reverend de Kock preach. Like, he's the equivalent of going viral. Like, Reverend de Kock went viral in the 1830s because of his preaching. And so people would travel to hear Reverend de Kock preach because it was richer than the gospel, than the fake gospel that they were hearing in their own local churches.
Wow, that's so. Is that what triggers the secession?
Yeah. So I mean, when you go viral, then you get a following, and so he had a following, and he actually wrote. So he wrote a book. I got the title here somewhere. Here, The Sheepfold of Christ, Attacked by Two Wolves and Defended by H. de Kock. That was his tagline. So yeah, no hashtags in there, but they're pretty much there.
That's as hashtag easy gets back then.
That's right. So he's publishing things because that's how things worked back then. You publish brochures and people would like pass them around like, oh, I got this awesome brochure. You got to read this, right? It's the equivalent of sharing things on Facebook or something like that, right?
They've taken a step since nailing something to a door.
That's right. But they're now printing it and distributing it as well. So that's one of the things. So two guys, there's two brothers out there who are sort of attacking the Canons of Dort, and he defends the Canons of Dort. That's one thing he does. Then another thing that Reverend de Kock does is members from neighboring churches come to him and say, you know what? I don't want to baptize my kid in my church. It's not a faithful church. I want to baptize my kid in your church. And he says, no, I can't do that. And eventually he feels bad for these parents. He does it anyway. So people come all the way from across the country to bring their kids to Ulrum to have their children baptized in the full gospel. The other thing that's happening at this time is that they're singing hymns in the churches, and some of these modernist ideas are creeping into the church through these hymns. This is a classic Dutch Reformed thing. They'll like to bring that one up.
Yeah, you're telling me.
It's the weeds too much, but in these hymns, that sort of the language is a bit more modernistic and a bit more about me and my relationship with Jesus Christ and my feelings and it's really touching on the feelings rather than being doctrinally accurate. And so he starts to, he writes a brochure. He says, testing the hymns and them being found wanting. And that also spreads. And so eventually they call him in front of the synodical boards and say, you know what, you're causing a ruckus. Like you can't be doing this. And they had a choice either to respond to what he said or to shut him up. And so they tried to shut him up. They suspended him. And he appeals, and they lift that for a while. But eventually, Reverend de Kock, he's on fire, and he keeps writing, and they depose him. And so he went through appeal after appeal. He even appealed to the king, but he was deposed. He lost his status. And if you're a minister, like, you're paid by the state. If you're deposed, you're out of a job. You're probably out of a house. My guess is he wasn't married, he had children, and so you're stuck. Like, that's a significant thing. But he feels he has no choice, and so it's actually in 1834 finally, at the urging of his, and I like this story, the urging of his consistory and his congregation, they urge him to break the bonds and say, no, we're done. So he's not a leader in that sense, as in he's preaching and the gospel's changing hearts and minds. And together as a body in Ulrum, they break the bonds. And so they meet in Ulrum and they sign a document called the Act of Separation or Return. And they sign this thing, the big thing, and they say, we secede from this state church. That's where you get the secession, not the succession. and they return to the truth of God's word. And so that you can find that document is translated. If you Google "act of secession or return," or "act of separation or return," I think it's Dr. Smith from our seminary who translated it. And you can read the whole article where they lay out their case there as well. And so slowly but surely, other ministers as well. At one point, there were 6 ministers who all seceded, and de Kock was the oldest one. He was 33. And all the other ones were younger, and they all left. Many of them weren't even trained yet. They were trained, but they hadn't had a call yet. And so, like for instance, Reverend Van Raalte, Albertus Van Raalte, he wanted to subscribe to the old subscription form, and so he wasn't allowed to be a minister. So he got called to those secession churches, and slowly but surely, those secession churches gained steam.
Wow. So if they decide to leave as a congregation, was that a thing that happened? Were there other churches in that time that weren't state churches? Was that like allowed? Were they getting a hard time from the government because of that?
That's what's interesting is that no, of course they're not allowed, and so what the state did is they persecuted them. So most of the secession people, they were not the elites; they were hard regular folks. You still had a class system very much back then. They were mostly the lower middle class that was doing this, and so the government pulled a page out of classic textbook is where they put soldiers in their homes, right? So they just imposed soldiers in these people's homes so they could monitor them. That's what the British did to the Americans in the American Revolution as well, is quarter soldiers in their homes, and that happened in a few other places, also in France. And so these people were forced to worship in secret. Reverend de Kock went to jail. People had their crops confiscated. All kinds of awful things happened to these people because they seceded from the state church, just in an effort to just shut this movement down and return to the status quo.
You see, what's the goal? I guess the goal is money. What other reason is there?
Yeah, it's a loss of control. Like at this time, you still have it in a little bit in history where it's like, if I'm the king and I can't control what religion people have, am I really the king?
Right.
We're getting later. It's 1800s. It's not quite like that, but you still have that whole movement happening in the French Revolution, even in Great Britain. I'm the king. I should be able to tell you what to believe, right? I should have that power.
Yeah, and I guess in that time, like those groups rose up, like militarily, if that's a word,
Yeah.
like the Huguenots, and like they were getting like those kind of guys, like movements were getting like slaughtered and persecuted.
That's right.
So I guess they posed a real political risk, not just a risk to the status quo, I guess.
Yeah, it threatens the stability of the Netherlands at this time. And so that's where you have that first wave of immigration. So it's actually from the secession of 1834, where you have 2 guys, Reverend Van Raalte and Reverend Schulte, who go emigrate to the United States, and they establish what will become eventually the Christian Reformed churches. In Holland, Michigan is the first group with Reverend Van Raalte, and they get into it. It's always messy. Reverend Schulte and him get into a disagreement. Reverend Schulte goes to Pella, Iowa. Pella is named after the city where when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, they fled to Pella. So he names that Pella, Iowa. So that's, if you've ever been down to Iowa, to the classic Dutch Reformed area, that's all founded by these folks in that whole area as well. So, Grand Rapids, Michigan, that whole area, and Iowa, these are settlers who leave after the secession of 1834.
Oh, well, not to get too much in the weeds, but what were they arguing about? Like, are they separate denominationally now, or are they kind of? No.
So eventually that becomes the Christian Reformed Church. In Holland, Michigan, it's actually interesting. They make contact with what's called the Reformed Church in America. So the Reformed Church in America is actually founded in the early 1600s when the Dutch have a colony in New Amsterdam, which is now New York. So one of the very first, if not the very first established church in the United States is actually a Dutch Reformed church. And it wasn't until about the 1700s they were still doing services in Dutch in the Reformed Church in America.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is interesting.
Our Dutchies get around.
Was that an immigration thing, or was that?
So that would have been the first colony of New Amsterdam, which eventually gets defeated, right? Or I think it's in a treaty where they lose that territory, and that would become New York, and it would become, of course, the great American city. Right, but it's originally New Amsterdam. The Reformed Church of America still exists today. It's a lot more liberal. today, and although it still holds the name Reformed, and it's facing its own struggles right now. I believe a schism of a group of conservative people breaking off. But in 1834 they go, and then in 1857 they basically realize that all the issues they had in the Netherlands are sort of the same problems in the Reformed Church of America, and so that's when they break off and they create what's now known as the Christian Reformed Church in North America.
Oh, interesting. All right. Well, I'm sure these things will parallel as we discuss the secession and what happened in Holland, because they always kind of seem to. Yeah. So, all right. So we had a whole group split off of the government-run Reformed Church, I guess. What happens to these people? Does the government kind of quash them? They get soldiers in their homes. How does that end? Because eventually, we don't have soldiers in our homes, so eventually that comes to an end. So what? Right.
So you have a whole group that leaves. That's one way to solve the problem. And the stories, if you ever read those stories, it's what they face there. Like Holland, Michigan today. If you ever get a chance to go there, there's actually there's a museum there and you can. It's fun to go there as a Dutch Reformed person, because the stuff you see in the museum is the stuff you see at your grandparents' house.
It's just the same. There's a bowl of Werthers on the table. It's
all that Delft blue stuff is what you see there. And But I went there as a kid. But there's a whole history of the Dutch Reformed settlers in Grand Rapids, and they face incredible hardship and death. Life expectancy was dismal. They did far more funerals than baptisms or weddings. It was wilderness. They basically got a piece of land and they carved it out and they established they got Calvin College today, and you start doing the list of all the things they accomplished is absolutely remarkable. Yeah, so that's one group. Back in the Netherlands, it's part of a larger shift that's taking place. So I'm not sure exactly the history, but eventually they get to a place of toleration where they're allowed to exist. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that complicates it, and we can't get into it here, is that the churches they all leave. Each individual church leaves. Some of them find common ground, but not all of them. And that's the frustrating thing about studying church history is we have a group. So all the ones that left, they must have all gotten along, right? No, it's never that.
That's never how it is.
That's right. If you put a bunch of malcontents into a room, you just breed more malcontents, right?
Yeah.
And even if they are zealous for what they believe and right in what they believe. And so you already have fragmentation. So the flow chart for Dutch church history gets complicated right away in 1834, because you have a group of them together, and then you have individual churches following individual leaders, and some of them find each other. And so if you ever want to map it out, you can. It exists out there, but it's really messy.
It's quite the tree, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, so we get down into a kind of another split, as far as I understand. I don't know what I'm talking. Which is this is all. Yeah, my mind's kind of in the early 1800s. I'm all right, that's like Reformation in my mind. That's so old.
Yeah.
Then we get into more recent history, into pushing into the 19th. Well, we're in the 19th century, pushing into the 20th century. I forget what it was, 86 maybe? 1886?
That's right. So you've had the secession first, and that exists. And in 1886, you have what's going to be another split off the state church. And that's where the great Dutch guy, Abraham Kuyper, comes in. Interestingly, not as a minister. He's initially trained as a minister. He leaves the ministry. He establishes a university. He establishes 2 newspapers. He becomes prime minister of the Netherlands. But, we remember him because he was an elder in the church in Amsterdam. But we'll get to that later. So in 1886, all the state church never changed. So when you have the Act of Secession return, they were calling them to Reformation, and the state church didn't respond, right? And I think that's also a pattern we have to see in church history. We don't celebrate splits, right? We grieve splits. And so what you would like to see is that when a group splits, the other ones are called to account and you have healing. And that didn't happen. So by 1886, all those issues still remain. They were still singing those hymns. They still weren't teaching total depravity. And the preaching was suffering, so much so that church attendance was very poor. And the pious were still meeting in separate groups. They weren't bringing about Reformation in their local churches. And so the issue that sort of brought 1886 around is that they had boiled church membership down to the point that when you made public profession of faith, you only had to confess the Trinity. That's it.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
So it's like, what do you believe? Well, I believe in the Trinity. Maybe the Apostles' Creed would be sufficient. But, in terms of how we understand it, is the Trinity. And so some churches said, well, we have a higher standard for church membership than that. And that's what happened in Amsterdam. Now, Amsterdam is huge. Just give me an impression. I don't know how big the church was, but they had 100 elders. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm not sure how you figure that out. I don't know all the logistics of it, but they had 100 elders.
All of Amsterdam must have been a church.
That's right. Yeah, it would have been.
That's
right?
huge.
Yeah. So they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to hold our members to a higher standard. So people in Amsterdam, what they would do is they'd go to a neighboring church, do public profession of faith there, and then take their attestation back to Amsterdam and say, here's my attestation, here I am.
Got
him, right? Like, it's like a religious loophole, right?
Yeah, right.
And the Consistory in Amsterdam decided that they weren't going to accept those membership transfers. And so that made its way back to Synod. And Synod actually deposed 80 out of the 100 consistory members of Amsterdam, including the great Abraham Kuyper. And so those 80 of consistory, along with members, they went into what they call dolianti, which means grieving. So they went to the 1886. The event is called we have the Secession of 1834. 1886 is called the dolianti, which is grieving. So they grieved what was happening to the churches. And so they also split off, and that same pattern happened all across the Netherlands. These groups also split off, looking to reform and return to the truth of God's word. Right. And so and the great leader in that was Abraham Kuyper, who had, he had a huge voice and so a huge following as well. He had some teachings that were not okay in terms of presumptive regeneration. People had problems with his teachings about common grace and about church. But that problem comes into it later. So you have the Secession churches and you have the Dolianti churches, and they realized pretty quickly, we got a lot in common. We actually left for all the same reasons. And there's actually a quote out there where one of the speakers at Synod says, look, you were more, not more holy, but like you showed us the way. You were right, and we erred by not leaving when you left. But now we're out, and we need to find common ground. And so over the course of 6 years, they grew together, and they united in 1892 into one federation of the Secession churches and the Dolianti churches.
Right.
Unless you think that simplifies things, it doesn't, because not all the Secession churches joined, and not all the Dolianti churches joined. So if you have two becoming one, it actually becomes three, right? Because you have the union and then ones who stay apart.
Sure,
right?
But then those ones didn't get together to make it simple.
No.
Yeah, no. Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Why would they?
In terms of our own history, that the Free Reformed churches were the group of churches that didn't join with the union.
Were they the secession churches?
Yes. Yeah. And so, if you track that, you see the influence in terms of how their church is structured, in terms of the style of their preaching, in terms of their own ecumenical relations, that whole, you can understand it from where they come from, right? So the Free Reformed churches still exist across, in our area here in Southern Ontario. We have lots of Free Reformed churches, and that's a split from that 1834 group.
Interesting.
Right?
So that's actually interesting, because when I was doing my brief amount of research for this, which I, was not at all comprehensive, I think it was Wikipedia that said that the Free Reformed churches are the Church of the Secession. So that's I guess that's where it comes from, because I guess they are like strictly the churches of the Secession, because they didn't make a move after that, I guess. That's
right. So in 1892, the Canadian Reformed churches, if we trace ours back to 1892, right? That's where we come out of. So when we were established in Canada, you still had that in the early years of the Canadian Reformed Church, reaching out to the Free Reformed churches saying, back in 1892, we recognize you as a faithful church, and we still recognize you as a faithful church, right? And it's only until recently that there's some dialogue going back and forth.
Right.
I mean, in the early years, there were, like, you can actually find a book that there was a whole get-together of Free Reformed and Canadian Reformed where they talked through all these things. So there certainly has been an attempt to grow together. We exist side by side. We work side by side in schools, but in terms of church federations, there's still a separation there.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've had discussions about that, and our relationship with the URC and also the Free Reformed. They're a little closer to the Free Reformed than we are.
That's right.
In terms of attestations and things like that.
And it's all, you could trace it all into the church history. Like if you would actually just work your way back through all these stories that you and I are talking about right now, you can sort of find the roots in those things. And so even though to you and I, it seems like ancient history, those events have real impacts on what happens still today.
Right. Yeah, that's something, because it's, I mean, it seems like it's like bred into your genetics. Even the hymn thing is like, you know, if you're Canadian Reformed, then you've had this problem in your past. That's somehow right. Your genetic code remembers.
That's right. Maybe.
So, yeah, okay. So the churches get together. We have like kind of three churches that come out of that merge, I guess. Yeah. What was the? Well, let's talk about Kuyper, I guess, because I kind of want to understand him, because he comes into the secession churches and he has an influence, but not like, you know, yeah, all positive, I guess. It's like you said. Was he part of this synod where he was deposed and I guess they must have been, were they excommunicated or just like kicked out?
I'm not sure they were ever excommunicated. I think they split off sort of before it ever came to that point, okay. Right? So they would have left the church and then united. And so he's like, if you look through the proceedings of 1892, like Kuyper speaks often. I believe at one point he's the chairman of the synod, just to add to his impressive resume as well.
You got to figure. That's right. Was he prime minister before that, or was that afterwards? Like what influence did he have as prime minister? Did he make any moves? Like
but Kuyper is very significant. It's actually interesting, because if I think of my early years, Kuyper was like a bad guy. Like, because he had bad teachings. Because when we get to the Liberation, which the Canadian Reformed churches come out of, Kuyper was sort of like suspect, right? And it's actually just recently, like when you hear Upper Canada come and speak, you know, they spend lots of time dealing with Kuyper's teachings and Kuyper's influence and stuff like that. So we can celebrate accomplishments even if we don't agree with everything. And I think we've come a ways in that way. It was like, it doesn't have to be a dichotomy of like, this guy's all good or all bad. It's, you know, we have some hesitations, but we recognize, you know, the Lord's gift in these things as well. And so Kuyper's, I mean, he's a larger than life figure. And I think in some ways, perhaps he pushed the issue. There were lots of secession churches that were nervous about Kuyper. They didn't really like his teachings, but because they had so much in common, they figured, we should just press on because it's more important to be together, right? And there were other groups that said, no, we don't want to go in that direction. And you see the fruits of that as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, we kind of had that nowadays a little bit too. We have churches that were very similar to, we're like, oh, we should get together. And then there's some, you're like, but this. You're like, okay.
And it takes time, right? It takes some of those generations because of the histories that go with it, right?
Yeah, I was kind of reflecting on that a little bit. Like, I mean, you were discussing it before. Like, you could just stick it on a timeline in your classroom and say, here's this, and put a couple marks on a chalkboard. But in the grand scheme of things, you're like, wow, they figured that out. That was only 200 years it took them to figure it out. And then now we're like, well, why does it take more than a week to figure this out?
That's right. Let's just bash it out, put a committee together, ad hoc, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what's so complicated?
That's right.
I guess. Yeah, when, you know, maybe people will look favorably on us for our, you know, discussion too, but
who knows?
So did Kuyper? I guess the Netherlands still had a monarch at that time, right?
Yeah, so he was prime minister.
So he was prime minister, but he doesn't have a lot of influence on the state church then.
So I mean, Kuyper's really the guy who, like, when you talk about sphere sovereignty, right? You've probably had heard those conversations where he starts carving out and saying, look, the church has its own sphere. And he really advocated for proper church government, right? That the government's not invested in it, but the church and the old Synod, the old Church Order of Dort, that there is a proper way to do it. So the church is its own sphere. And he advocated for Christian schools that parents are a sphere and the state has a sphere. And he really mapped all that out. So he, I mean, even among secular people, like, Kuyper made it overseas. He spoke at Harvard, right? Oh, wow. And he had you can Google that too, a series of Harvard lectures. And still there's secular people that are impressed with Kuyper for his ability to create a vision for where the church exists, but it's a separate sphere from the state. And that's people have written books on that. They're still writing books about that.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, we talked about COVID, so
that's right. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess there's not a YouTube of this Harvard lecture, so it's harder to capture for a podcast listeners.
AI can do that for us.
Yeah. We'll have to get someone to record him onto audiobook or something.
That's right. Yeah.
But okay, so he is quite an influence, but I guess we're getting away from the time where, we're having wars over religion in Europe, and he's kind of getting into a bit of a, kinder era in Europe.
It's a civil discussion, right? And it's a matter of where the church has a place to figure these things out, and the state doesn't really as much have anything to do with it anymore, right? Where that division, that's happening all across Europe, is the division between church and state is separating, not always in a positive way. Church and state should be separate, but religion and state should not be. And that's where you start to drift in other parts of the world as well, right?
Right. Yeah, I guess so. So the politicians are, okay to go with their Enlightenment thinking and just leave the church alone. Yeah.
So what you have then is the seeds for the next events that we'll talk about then is 1944, which is the liberation. The seeds for that are already in 1892, right? Because in 1892 you have people who are concerned about Kuyper's teaching, but they're not going to make it a stumbling block, right? Mm-hmm. And those never go away because Kuyper's teachings become quite well established. His teachings about sort of the church, about common grace, about presumptive regeneration. We won't get into that here. But all these heavy doctrinal issues, people were uncomfortable with that. So that was the one thing. But the other thing that happened was that the synod of that 1892 church started becoming quite hierarchical. So there was an event in the 1920s where a minister said, I don't take the first chapters of Genesis literally. And they convene synod and they depose him. And synod shouldn't depose anybody. The consistory deposes. And so if you trace that whole story, it's a minister by Reverend Gail Kirkin. Synod oversteps their boundaries. And so you have two issues in the late 1930s. You have hierarchical tendencies and you have Kuyper's teachings. And so Synod, for instance, met quite some time and then disbanded and then got back together again. And Synod shouldn't do those things. Synod can only deal with issues that are put on their table from lower assemblies or from consistories, right? Yeah. But Synod sort of operated as its own authority and its own thing as well. And so there were several people spoke out about this. There are three main guys. Just add to our name repertoire. One guy, his name, I don't know his first name, A. Jans. He was actually a school principal. I like him because he's a county guy and he's a principal.
He's one of your guys? Yeah.
He's one of my guys. And another guy, Professor Heidanis, he spoke against the hierarchical tendencies. And then the main guy was Dr. Klaas Skilder. So, if we're talking about the Canadian Reformed, I used to call them the Canadian Reformed homeboys. Dr. Klaas Skilder was one of them, right? And he opposed Kuyper's teachings about covenants, about regeneration, about church. And he defended historical redemptive preaching. And so they spoke out against these things. And so what they did is they just had magazines. They just published articles against each other, right?
They just clarioned it.
they clarioned it out. The Reformatsi, I think, is the newspaper there.
Okay.
And so they went back and forth. And the synod convenes and they try to settle things. But this is 1939. And so Hitler's invading Poland and he's invading the Netherlands. And so the people are like, you know what, let's hold off on this. Like, we got other fish to fry. And they said, no, we're going to do this anyway. So they convened synod anyway. And in the meantime, Skilder's writing against the Nazi government, like heavily. Hitler's not a legitimate leader. We have to oppose them. Encouraging members to join the resistance. Like he strongly opposes that. Whereas other Dutch reformers didn't necessarily speak so strongly against it.
Right.
And so the Germans, he actually ends up in prison, and the Germans say, you can't write anymore. Like, you're not allowed to. And so he's defenseless. So the main spokesperson against these issues is defenseless. And so synod convenes again, and they adopt what are called doctrinal pronouncements. They basically said, this is what we agree about these topics: presumptive regeneration, common grace. And so Skilder, in the meantime, is sending private letters trying to get into synod, and they ignore him. And actually, they go beyond ignoring him. They suspend him. So synod suspends Dr. Skilder, even though even in our churches still today, the seminary professors are under the supervision of local churches, right? They're the ones who hold their credentials, if you will, yep. Right? And so if they were ever wrong in teaching, it's consistory who opposes them, not synod.
Right.
Although
Even though Synod appoints them to the seminary.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. Because when I was just before I left Hamilton to come up Calgary way, we had a seminary professor move into the church, and we had it was an interesting thing because you have to technically call him as a minister,
right.
And even though he's not going to preach off the pulpit or draw a salary from the church or anything, yeah, right.
And so those are these neat pieces that are explained through our church history, right?
Right.
Because it's still retaining those things from those old ones. So Skilder, they suspend him for support, including, and also Professor Heidanis as well, and they're supported as well. And so there's a whole bunch of they depose whole consistories, they deposed whole congregations, like they just unilaterally tried to shut the whole thing down. And so, and this is what they're pointing out, is that Synod was taking on more authority for itself. Synod can't bring things to their own table. Business always has to come from a lower one all the way up there. And if you ever read the Acts of Synod, which most people don't do, there's a whole bunch of rules about admissibility. And those things also, sometimes you think, I remember the first time I sat in consistory, I was like, man, is this ever unnecessarily complicated? But all those things have roots in our church history, lessons, if you will, that we've learned. And so you can gain a greater appreciation for them when you understand sort of the historical roots.
Well, you get frustrated because everything moves so slow. We actually did an episode summarizing the last synod and kind of talking through some of the issues. And yeah, one thing that hit me about that too was you get at the synod table and then there's two proposals and both are no good. Then can't you just make a third proposal? It's no, we got to go back 3 years from now. We'll have another proposal. That'll be a shoe in because we already discussed it. But it's just it's something yeah, but couldn't you just do it there? But I guess this is the history that shows probably not a good idea.
So, and you could their thing is that you can say, well, that's tradition. Well, no, you could go back to 1619 and look at the Church Order of Dort, which our church order is based on, and understand sort of the biblical reasons for that. And there are some, if you read through the book of Acts, through parts of the New Testament, there's principles at play there that we can draw out from to explain those things. And that's what Skilder and Heidanis was doing, saying, you know what, this is not right. And so eventually things came to a head. And so in 1944, they get together in The Hague, and they sign this time what's called the Act of Liberation and Return. And so they see themselves as the official continuation of the 1892 church, but liberated, or in Dutch, vrijgemaakt, right? And they, interestingly, recently merged back with the group they split off with in 1944. So that doesn't exist anymore. But that's that's more modern history. So really, in 1944, they say we are liberating ourselves from hierarchy and extra scriptural binding, where they went beyond the confessions and they said, we are going to bind all ministers to that. And that's why I think you still see a tendency today at Synod to not sort of adopt pronouncements that go beyond confessions. So you'll hear arguments every once in a while that we have to update our confessions or add things in terms of some of the sexuality and gender ideology. There's a hesitancy to do that also because of our history, that we add on pronouncements over and above these three forms of unity.
Right.
And that comes from 1944.
Right, that makes good sense. So from from 1892, where we have this merger, I guess, to the 1944. I mean, that's only 52 years. That's the same people. Skilder would have been around for both.
Yeah,
same generation-ish.
I don't know all their biographies well enough. In some cases, I'm not sure the union ever totally worked. In some places, you had Reformed Church A and Reformed Church B, where one was a Secession church and one was a Union church, and they had a hard time getting together because you don't just forget. If you're an 1834 person, you don't just forget that those people, that church or that state or that government mistreated you. And, now we're on the same page. We're going to, it takes a long time. And in some places, I'm not sure it ever resolved itself.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess you see this, everyone has their history. So it's even nowadays, you can hardly blame people for having their history and being aware of what they should be aware of. Right. Yeah.
And it takes generations, right? So, one of the last things you want to discuss was sort of how did we get to the Canadian Reformed churches today? How did we get here? Well, that has its own history that informs sort of our current history as well. So you have after the liberation and the liberation of the Netherlands as well, you have all these people who like housing was awful, prospects was not great. And so you had people considering immigration. And then church life was also difficult, right? You had families where these ones joined the liberations, these ones did not join the liberation, right? So that causes significant family rifts. And so how do you solve those? Well, you just leave, right? And so you have people from the liberation who looked at their options, and basically you could choose South Africa, Australia, or Canada, and each of them had their own historical roots as to why that would be an appropriate fit. And people chose based on sometimes randomly, or perhaps they didn't make a real choice at all, or just by God's providence. But the liberation transplanted itself into Australia, South Africa.
So is that something you see, like, is that similar to like the Anabaptists who kind of get kicked out? Like, or I'm just kind of curious about that move, because we just come through the war, and then I can't even believe they're dealing with the stuff during the war. It's like the stories you hear from the war are insane too. And then 1944, they're like, let's get to it. So they separate, but then it's kind of like socioeconomic issues that also drive the immigration, no? Like they kind of...
Mostly. I'm not sure it was religious at all. Like,
right. So is it that there's a wave like of immigration regardless of the religion, and then it just so happens that included in that is, you know, our ancestors who come here and you know, Christians who go to different places? Was there like an equal proportion of like liberated and non-liberated people moving, or was it like liberated was kind of like, let's get out? Because
I think it's fairly universal. Like it's lots of Dutch people, and in 1944, let's be clear, most Dutch people are Reformed, right? So when we think of Canada here, we have the Netherlands Reformed congregations. Many of them came in the same time our grandparents and great grandparents came. The CRC grew like crazy when many of them came, right? Because if you weren't part of the liberation, you just joined the Christian Reformed Church, or you join the Free Reformed Church, or the Netherlands Reformed congregations, right? So all of those churches existed in some ways, but they really were also established. So they basically took the church issues from the Netherlands and just carried them overseas. But not on purpose, because if you read the early stories of the Canadian Reformed churches, what they did is they settled in places, often somewhat randomly. If like I grew up, I mean, we were in Winnipeg. You had people who were like, "Oh, we were supposed to go to BC, but the train dropped us off in Carmen." Right? Yeah, right.
It does seem random. Like Nearlandia seems random to me. Even living in Calgary, I'm like, and why up there?
That's right.
The churches in, like, people come to Calgary and the first thing they say is like, why is this church? Our church is pretty small. Like we have like 250 people or something. But it's a huge city, and it's like it's bigger than Edmonton. And our Canadian Reformed Church in Edmonton is, the whole community up there is huge. It's like 4 churches in Edmonton and then more up north, and like it's just surprised to see where everybody ends up. But I guess it's the same thing as the Iowa. Is it Iowa? And Michigan, right? Like, why there? Like, it's just kind of
it's politics. Is the government has this group of people who are known to be industrious and hardworking.
They're like, stick them in the north.
You plop them in undesirable places, sort of, and make sure they have a go at it. And then a lot of it is networking, like one networks the other and sponsors the other. And the stories are absolutely incredible. And most of them, if you read the stories, they went first to local churches. So there was never an intent to start a liberated church in Canada. That was not the intent. I've heard stories of people attending the local Anglican church, because there are Anglican churches that are quite Reformed, but they couldn't find their feet there. But many of them found the local CRC and started attending there, the Christian Reformed churches. And what they tried to do is they had just come out of liberation, which is like a significant thing to do. Like, you don't do that easily. And so these issues were they were near and dear to them. And so they would take that to the consistories at the local Christian Reformed churches and try to get them to understand sort of what the issues were. And the Christian Reformed church at their synod had decided, we're not taking a side, right? We're not making a side between the liberated or the other church. We're not going to pick a side. That's their squabble over there. We exist over here. But what happened was, when Skilder came overseas for a speaking tour, they were advised not to welcome him on their pulpit because he was a schismatic. So they didn't take a stand, but they did take a stand. And so when the liberated people came to the local Christian Reformed churches and tried to bring up these issues about the Netherlands, including doctrinal issues, not just synod issues, they weren't reciprocated. And so they eventually decided, only after exhausting the other resources, that they would establish these churches. And if you ever read the book Inheritance Preserved, that's the whole story of these immigrants that are, by way of chain letters and letters back and forth, are establishing churches. So that in the 1950s, I think in the year 1956 were established, or 5 were established: Lethbridge, Edmonton, Neerlandia, Georgetown, which is Orangeville, New Westminster in BC, and then Carmen, right? Homewood at the time. So it was only really after they were here for a while that you established Canadian Reformed churches.
So we don't understand that as a split, though, eh? So it wasn't really a uniform, everyone kind of joined the CRC, got frustrated, and split off. It's more like we just never really found a home as liberated church.
And every story of every individual is different, because in some cases they did find a home. In other cases, they, like at one point, there was a partnering with the Protestant Reformed churches, which is a church that split off of the Christian Reformed churches. So at one point in Hamilton, for instance, the 2 churches merged, the Canadian Reformed Church and the Protestant Reformed Church, and then split apart again.
Oh, wow.
These are stories that are really difficult, and they're, these immigrants also, they had larger than life characters, because that's what it took to be an immigrant, right?
We've actually talked about this in the podcast too before, that it's interesting that you have immigration. You have to be a certain character to immigrate, and to even be successful at all, and not just to follow the, if you're a guy building a school or building a church, it's like, no wonder these stories are exciting, because these guys must have been characters. Like, just they had a willpower to make business work, and they're, settle in, but they didn't have, they came through the liberation, I guess, and they just had a bone to pick, I guess. A little bit.
They were staunch in their faith, and they lived out of it, right? And they didn't talk about it necessarily. I remember visiting an older couple who was in my ward and trying to get a sense for, like, how did you walk by faith in those early years? And they said, Mark, we didn't talk like that. Like, that's the way other people talk, like walk by faith, a prayer-filled life. Like, they just lived out of faith, because what other option did you have?
Yeah, right.
They were living on a prayer. Like, that's all they literally had, right? And so they, when we talk about living by faith and walking by prayer, that's all they literally had. Like, they didn't have other options to fall back on, and so it's their existence, and that's the roots of our institutions that we have here in Canada. Only what are we, 7 years later? And it's remarkable what's established here.
Yeah, it really is.
It's still fresh. So for instance, in some places, the history between the URC and the CanRC can be difficult, because that history is still alive, where liberated people went to the Christian Reformed Church and said, well, we don't want to join this church, we're going to start our own thing. And now those people have left the URC, and they say, oh, okay, it left the Christian Reformed Church and just started the United Reformed Church. Oh, now you're good enough for us. And it's like, oh, now we're good enough for you? Right? So this takes time. There are layers, because there's human stories involved, and there's human feelings and beliefs, and it's messy.
It's again, if you look back on the timeline of these churches that got together successfully or that split apart, there's hundreds of years in there sometimes, and the ones that aren't probably didn't go good. So that's probably something we can learn from. And I think, like, as we get further, more generations in, like, I guess I'm 3rd generation Canadian Dutch Reformed, but as we get further in, where do you see this? Like, do you see these things coming together, like, based on the history that we have? Do you see us like URC, FRC kind of?
It's hard to say. Our generation's not great at, like, the previous generation. What they read and what they were busy with is remarkable. Like, you'd have the average worker who was going home and reading Calvin's Institutes. Now, I don't know about you. Like, I've read excerpts. I have not read Calvin's Institutes, right?
No,
I study, right? Like, so I don't spend my evenings doing that. That's what they did. Like, they were reading Bavinck, they were reading Kuyper, they were reading, like, heavy duty stuff. And maybe they didn't talk about their faith as openly and expressly as perhaps our generation has, but they knew their doctrines, right? So it's not all all bad. Like sometimes I think we're quick to say, those are all past, like, bygones be bygones. Let's drop it all. And I think that's not the way to go either. But we're also keen to look poorly on our own heritage, right? I'm amazed when I stumble on like the Gospel Coalition and other websites who are discovering our old dead Dutch guys and loving them, right? And so people are retranslating Schilder stuff right now. They're retranslating all these people that are in our heritage and finding beauty in it. And some of us are inclined to squander those things. So certainly, when we talk about ethnicity and about our Dutchness, we have to be careful about those things. But you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we're able to see that churches are becoming more multicultural, and we have to be careful about what is cultural and what is theological, and be very careful about that and navigate that slowly and methodically, even though sometimes we just want to hurry up. Right?
Right.
There are others looking out into our community and liking what they see and wanting to join in it, while we have some people in our own community who want to throw it all away and start from scratch, right? So church life it wasn't easy in 1834, it wasn't easy in 1886, it wasn't easy in 1892, it wasn't easy in 1944. We can't expect it to be easy in 2023.
Yeah, it just seems like when you look at history, you think, well, that was then, now is now. We could deal with it now, right? I mean, I'm sure they thought the same thing in 1944. They were like, well, we've got it dealt with now. We've got it right figured out. When I was looking into this a little bit, I was reading a little bit on the CRC history too, and it's funny that you say that, because like I'm curious about the term Dutch Church or Dutch Reformed, because a lot of people in our society now don't like the term, because it's like ethno, whatever, like centric, I guess. So like we don't like things that are like, no, it's us and not you. Like that's what it sounds like. But I guess you can mean Dutch Church in the terms of like history, but it is so much the Dutch Church, Dutch Reformed, right? The CRC writes on their website, like, we are not a Dutch Reformed church. Like that's what they're like. They're excited to kind of get away from that term. Yep. Whereas like, so it kind of sounded like they were like, well, we were here before the CanRC and stuff came over. So we've been here since the 1600s. Well, then we're not really Dutch Reformed. We're something else. We've been here longer. So we've kind of shed that brand. Right. But like shedding that kind of like brand isn't really, I don't find it like helpful, but.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to look at and say what we've been successful at. And I mean, I'm sitting here speaking to you from Covenant Canadian Reformed Teachers College. And one of the things that we've been successful at is establishing covenant schools where we tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of God. And we tell them about who they are. And we tell them about the churches they join and about the people who they are. And we practice a term I stumbled upon recently, covenant succession, that we tell the next generation so that they indeed do that. And if you cease to do that, you're going to have a split of generations. So when we have generations of Dutch Reformed Christians, if you ask the average Dutch Reformed Christian, how far back do you have to go before you find out people who aren't Christians? Many of us can't do it. Well, that's nothing but blessing upon blessing. Right? Like that's an incredible riches. And let's find a way to share that riches of telling the next generation and of sharing that way of covenant education. I know I've had some contact with the folks at Beacon Hill Christian School in Toronto, where they're establishing a new school. And they're excited about this idea of covenant Christian education and exploring ways to share with that in what's going to be a most multicultural Canadian Reformed, quasi-Canadian Reformed school, right? So they're busy exploring and thinking about what that looks like, and how do we share our joy of covenant succession, of covenant schools, of covenant education with others as something that's rich in our heritage and not something to be embarrassed about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love just walking through this history, because it just makes you realize, like, it's not us because we're Dutch. It's just that's where it came from. So if we can share, if we can make other cultural people who are Reformed appreciate what happened in Holland and the struggle, like it hasn't been easy, I guess, not for us, but for everybody else. If we can make them appreciate what what's been done in the past in our history, in our heritage, like, then I think there's a lot of wisdom there. And, we could do all sorts of things with church polity and whatever, but there's recognizing the work that's been done and the struggles that have been had. So I think that's really important, even in our cultural context. So this has been, this has been so good. Is there anything else that you had in mind to mention that we didn't get to touch on? I mean, we kind of walked through the whole history up till now, but
so I think the last little piece is that just encouraging people to explore it. Like I taught it in grade 10, and I've taught it now at Teachers College, and both of those, I'll be honest, is not easy. It's hard to they're intrigued by it, but you can get lost in the weeds, and it seems like a broken and a human history. But if you can tell it well using good themes and stories and sort of keep that thread going through all of church history, you can't but stand amazed at God's faithfulness, that here we are in 2023. And we have a wealth of incredible resources at our fingertips that seems to be exploding. Like if you spend some time listening to other podcasts and reading books, the riches of the Reformation that were rediscovered in those days, and the riches of the New Testament of the gospel, there's so much to grow and to learn. And that's an Old Testament to the Lord's faithfulness, not to our Dutchness, not to our homeboys, if you will, but to God's faithfulness to the churches and his love for the saints. And in some ways, I think it's encouraging, because it can be difficult to live in our times, look at the world around us and say, how did we get here? But in some ways, the Lord set an antithesis at the beginning. He says, look, this is one side and this is the other side. And it's never been more clear. And so the church should be the church, and believers should be believers, and live that way in the midst of the world. And that's what God calls us to first and foremost. And church history gives us incredible examples of what that looks like. Yeah.
And be thankful for, I mean, I guess even what we have in the political sphere. I mean, we get down on it a lot, like, wow, look where the world's going, look where our politicians are headed, but we still have freedom, and we still have, I mean, a lot more than what, I mean, I didn't know or couldn't imagine having a soldier in your house if you decided to separate from the church. That's just not something that even enters my mind as a younger person growing up in the Canadian Reformed Church. Is like, yeah. I mean, even if you were to split, it would just be, it's got nothing to do with the government. So that's man, it's been informative. I definitely want to do some more reading on it and stuff. Do you have any books? You mentioned Inheritance Preserved. I know that's really in the weeds, I guess, in our Canadian context. But
yeah, I should have actually looked at this earlier. Like Reverend Eric Campen has a wonderful book, a survey of it, Sharing in Abraham's Blessings. He has one that sort of does the whole thing. It doesn't get into the Dutch church history. So if you like the Dutch church history stuff, then like something like Inheritance Preserved is the way to go. There is a book out there called 1834 about Reverend de Kock. You can search that one. And there are other books that have been published over the years, but a lot of it is difficult to navigate. So I wouldn't say anybody's published a popular version yet. I'm not sure if that exists or could exist. But right. If you do some Googling, most church websites will give you the rundown as well for the overall scheme of things. And from there, you can find more articles here or there. But in terms of church history, there's more and more books out there that are making it popular, also for kids to read that as well. Like Simonetta Carr, I think she's down from the United States. She's got a podcast going on church history, and she writes a whole bunch of books. So if you do some Googling, it's not hard to find, and it's just a good way to continue on appreciating what God has done for us.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate it. Hopefully people found this informative. I've definitely learned a whole bunch, things I didn't know. And it's interesting to talk about. I mean, I'm only 30, or I am 30, I guess. Depends on which way you look at it. But I was talking to some of my friends who were, similar age, and they're like, well, I wouldn't have been interested in that like earlier on, but now I start to feel old because I want to like learn about church history and stuff. So hopefully this is useful even for, teenagers who are, are you just wondering where we came from? And I'm sure you've touched on things that the older generation will be like, yeah, I remember that guy.
Yes.
So, no, appreciate your time. Thanks, Mark, for all your expertise. I know you don't think you're an expert, but this was quite informative. So,
Excellent. I enjoyed the opportunity.
Hey, absolutely. So, everybody, thanks for listening. Until next time, keep having real talk.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time.